To introduce our speaker today, Ryan Ruffaner. Ryan is a former administrator at a Unity Church, and he currently works as an industrial organizational psychologist for Houston Community College. He's also a group leader for the Citizens Climate Lobby, and we've had conversations with him in this regard, and this talks to Congress about bipartisan climate change legislation. He's also a Braver Angels member, which brings people together from different sides of the political spectrum to talk about polarizing topics respectfully. And today, Ryan is going to speak to us about barriers to belonging. Welcome.
Good morning, y'all. Let me just adjust this real quick. It's good to be back here. As you just heard, I have been here to talk about the Citizens Climate Lobby. I've also been here to talk about beauty, nurturing our awareness of beauty. This is one of my favorite places to come. I love, honestly, a lot of things about it. It's worth the drive, you know. So yes, I'm here today to talk to you about overcoming barriers to belonging. And there are two types of belonging that I'm going to talk about today. One of them is belonging to ourselves. This is feeling at home within our own body, but most of all within our own mind. The second type of belonging is what we typically think of when we hear the word, the social sense of belonging, belonging with others. So first I'm going to talk a bit about the barriers to these different types of belongings and then the strategies that we can use to overcome them. So to belong with ourselves, we first have to become comfortable with ourselves. Well, how do we become comfortable with ourselves? We have to know ourselves. And one of the biggest barriers to knowing ourselves is something that has been with us from the very beginning of time, but is especially with us now in the age of the 24-hour news cycle, streaming services on demand, social media, our phones, ridden with apps and bloops and blings, notifications for things that, if we're honest, we really don't need. This is the impulse to constant distraction. In many ways, we are constantly distracted. When we are, let's say, mentally suffering, we're distracted because we're trying to escape from the present moment. But even when we're having a good time, we can find ourselves distracted too. You know, we can be thinking about what might happen in the future, what has happened in the past. We might be thinking about what could be different in this present moment to make it better. Distracted, distracted, distracted. And one of the best ways to overcome this constant distraction, to bring ourselves back to the present moment, is something that I've talked about here before, which is mindfulness and mindfulness meditation. Now, mindfulness is not inherently about mantras or affirmations or listening to the sound of waves or whale noises or something like that. It's about being acutely aware of whatever is happening in your mind in the present moment, whatever that is, good, bad, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. I was reading this one book a little while ago called Dopamine Nation by the psychologist Dr. Anna Lemke. And although it's technically a book about addiction, it is also about feeling more comfortable within our own skin. So she's talking to one of her patients who is addicted to her cell phone, to social media. This patient also has anxiety and depression. And Dr. Lemke recommends meditation as a way of becoming more comfortable with herself. So I'm going to quote here directly from the book because it's a great quote. She recommends meditation as a way of becoming familiar with oneself, of letting our experience unfold without trying to control it or run away from it. And then she says, it's pretty exhausting avoiding yourself all the time. And I love that quote. I mean, how can we become comfortable in our own skin if we're not even aware of who we are? And the patient, echoing what many people have said about meditation before they get into it, and echoing teenagers everywhere, said, yeah, but it's so boring. I don't want to just sit there with my thoughts. And Dr. Lemke says, you know, yes, it can be boring at first, but it can also be terrifying because it forces us to come face to face with questions of meaning and purpose. Boredom is an opportunity for discovery and invention. It creates the space necessary for new thought to form, without which we are endlessly reacting to stimuli around us, rather than allowing ourselves to be within our lived experience. So the first way to become more comfortable with yourself, to belong more fully to yourself, is to become aware of what's going on in your own body and mind through mindfulness. The second technique I'd recommend is contemplation and reflection through writing. I recommend writing as opposed to just thinking, because sometimes our thoughts are subject to revision or forgetfulness. I mean, how many times have we said, I don't need to write that down, I'll remember it later, and then boop, there it goes, gone. You know, Socrates once said, the unexamined life is not worth living, and what he meant by that is, it is a valuable practice to reflect on who we are, what we've done, and why we do it, so we can aim better at the highest possible version of ourselves. Now, this is different from mindfulness. Mindfulness is about stepping back from your stream of consciousness and watching the thoughts go by from a more detached perspective. This is about directing your thoughts through analysis and really asking yourself the deeper questions. This is important to do privately as opposed to publicly, right? Don't do it on social media. Don't do it through a blog or a vlog. I've seen people do that, like, here's what's on my mind today. I'm like, no, don't do that, because if you do that, you're fully aware that other people have the opportunity to judge you, and so you might hold back. The best way to get to know yourself is to be what Dr. Lemke calls radically honest. This is honesty in a way that might expose your foibles or entail consequences. It's about a truthful autobiography where you can be nakedly vulnerable and honest with who you are, your intentions and motivations. I mean, let me ask you this. Does anybody in here have a diary or journal? Have you ever diary or journal? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you would want somebody you've never met, a stranger, let's say, to read that diary or journal? Yeah, no, absolutely not. And we're not bad people, we're not bad people, but we know that we're vulnerable with ourselves in a way that we wouldn't necessarily want other people to know about, And that's okay. That's good for getting to know ourselves, the true us. Belonging, like so many things in life, must be rooted in truth. The third thing we can do is to articulate our values and our goals, but our values first. Why should we do our values first? Well, because if we're not careful, we can adjust our values to fit our goals rather than the other way around. And maybe our goals aren't things that we would actually care about if we were to examine them on a deeper level. Maybe if we really look into what we're pursuing is something that we actually care about. Maybe it's something that our parents wanted us to want, or we feel like society has nudged us to want. There's a lot of people in my generation who say, like, I want to be rich, I want to own my own business, I want to have a fancy car, this, that, the other. And you ask them why they want these things. And a lot of what it really boils down to isn't about being rich, and it's not about being a CEO or owning their own company. It's about being financially stable, which is very different from being like a multi-billionaire, or they want to not be micromanaged in their job. They want to have some autonomy over their work. Well, that's great, but you don't need to be a CEO working 60 to 80 hours per week to do that. Now, why does this matter? Well, because no matter what we do with our lives, every time we make a choice, we close off other pathways. We choose this instead of the infinite things we could have chosen. In order to go down any path, we have to make an unlimited amount of sacrifices. And these might not be sacrifices that we'd be willing to make if we really knew what we wanted to aim at, what our values were. And speaking of belonging to ourselves, this is not just important because when we articulate our values as clearly and precisely as possible, we can then aim at the highest version of ourselves, but also because there are times when, I'll use myself as an example, when I'm feeling lonely in a crowd or I'm feeling lonely in myself, and I ask myself, am I really living my values right now? Am I in a place that allows me to live my values? Or am I pretending to be someone else to fit in? And oftentimes asking that question will start me on the process of belonging more fully to myself again. We should turn toward rather than away from ourselves. Yes, there are distractions everywhere, but through mindfulness meditation, we can become aware of who we are. Through reflection in writing, we can become aware of who we want to be and aim more completely at that. In a way, these three strategies are a self-reinforcing cycle because we can't aim at what we're not aware of, and we can't check if we're living our values if we're also not reflecting critically on our own lives. But of course, this isn't the only form of belonging. The other form of belonging is the social sense of belonging. So, what is the main barrier to social belonging? I would say the biggest barrier is toxic tribalism. This is creating an us-them dynamic along arbitrary or superficial lines. Things that seem to matter, but if we really looked at a deeper level or if we got to know people better, we'd realize, they matter a little, they don't matter that much. And I would say the biggest one right now, and I'm glad that some of the people here I've heard talking about braver angels, because it sort of ties into that. The biggest barrier, I think, right now, feeding into toxic tribalism, has been this hyper-politicization of everything. Everything seems to be brought into the political categories, like there's a big amoeba just gobbling things up, And it reminds me of this expression that I believe came from the late 1960s, 1970s, that said the personal is political. And I've seen this sort of idea running through conversations, I use that loosely, on social media. And it sounds powerful and punchy and confident, the personal is political. But is it necessarily true? I mean, certainly the political is personal for many people because public policies influence our lives. I mean, that's what they're meant to do. But is the personal always political? Is the love we have for our mothers, our fathers, our brothers, our sisters, our friends, our spouses, our pets, is that feeling political? And if it is, it shouldn't be. What about our goals in life? Assuming they're aligned with our values, but even if they're not, are we doing what we do for explicitly political reasons because we're these scheming, manipulative, Machiavellian masterminds because we want to dominate or control other people? I would say no. We do what we do because we think, rightly or wrongly, it will lead to a greater feeling of happiness and less suffering, greater feelings of belonging. And if we accept this as true for ourselves, is it really so hard to believe that even the people we strongly disagree with are also acting out of these same principles? We've put politics before people. Not all of us, granted. We've done this thinking it would lead to greater connectedness and belonging. I mean, surely if we surround ourselves with people who think as I do, think as we do, believe as we do, say the same things, surely we would feel more at home. We would feel happier. Now, it turns out the answer is no. And there's been some social psychology research done on this. And I'm going to quote here directly from the American professor and author Brené Brown from her book, Braving the Wilderness. She said, quote, "While we may all be gathered behind the same bunkers of political or social belief and ideology, we're still alone in them. And even worse, we're constantly monitoring ourselves. The looming threat of blowback, should we voice an opinion or idea that challenges our bunker mates, keeps us anxious. When all that binds us is what we believe rather than who we are, changing our mind or challenging the collective ideology is risky." She then goes on to say, "When a group or community doesn't tolerate dissent and disagreement, it forgoes any experience of inextricable connection. There is no true belonging, only an unspoken treaty to hate the same people. And this fuels our spiritual crisis of disconnection." I've noticed how sometimes, not always, mind you, but sometimes the people who talk the most about patriotism are also sometimes the first to denounce other people as being un-American simply for having a different perspective or belief. I've also noticed how sometimes the people who talk the most about diversity and inclusion are also sometimes, again, not always, but sometimes the first to exclude people for having a different opinion or belief or perspective. This idea that the personal is political has warped our sense of love for each other into a pseudo-moral ultimatum where we subsume our shared universal values under our political stance at the moment, to this us-them dynamic where you're either with us or you're against us. And from here, it's only a small step to believing that a person with a different political stance has a different moral values from us, that they're maybe even morally repugnant. And then, of course, because the personal is political, so to speak, we take this not only as a moral offense, but as a personal offense. We get personally outraged by it. How dare they think differently from me? And I'm not immune to this. I'm not standing up here like some kind of saint. I do have this sometimes where I'm like, how dare they? You know, like an old-timey British judge shaking his jowls. You know? And then I have to remind myself, I mean, like, did I really think people would only disagree with me based on, like, their favorite color? Like, I'd be like, my favorite color is blue. And they'd be like, mine's orange. And I'd be like, you know, like, of course we're going to disagree about things. So what can we do to belong more fully with others, especially people we disagree with? Well, first and foremost, we have to put people before politics. People have political stances, but that's not the only thing they have. And this is especially egregious in America, where I know there are technically other parties, but I mean, it seems like there's only two camps. And we know that people can't be boiled down into two categories. And yet this seems to be what we as a society have gotten used to doing. Everybody fits into this or that. We've gotten so good at escaping binary thinking and other things, except when it comes to politics, especially on social media, this seems to be something we forget. The first thing we can do beyond that is to assume the best of other people, especially their intentions. No one is a mind reader. I'm not a mind reader. Y'all aren't a mind reader. People on social media, even though they act like it sometimes, aren't mind readers. I mean, have y'all noticed that? How sometimes somebody will comment under a post, and it's like they're trying to like be Sherlock Holmes. They're like, oh, yes, I deduce that what you actually meant was this, and I further deduce that your childhood had blah, 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 blah. And you're like, what are you on about right now? You have no idea. And they're just assuming and assuming and assuming. We have to assume the best of other people. And you know what? Maybe we'll be wrong. But we can always revise our opinions later. It is harder to reverse a critical judgment once it's sunk into our heads than to abstain from making that judgment in the first place. The second thing we can do is to assume that everyone has something valuable to teach us. And I want to emphasize this because sometimes what I've seen, regardless of the opinion, is, well, let me put it this way. What people have to teach us is not merely an assertion of our own ego's supremacy. And what I mean by that is, if you're listening to other people and saying, yeah, well, they have something to teach me, but what they have to teach me is that we are smart and they're stupid. We're informed and they're ignorant. We're good, they're bad. We're awesome, they suck. That's not going to make you very open-minded and receptive to other people's perspectives. It's not going to nourish feelings of belonging. We have to listen to other people because, I mean, really, what are the odds that you or I know everything there is to know about the world? And what are the odds that the only people who have something valuable to teach us are the people who already agree with us on everything? There is very little room for new wisdom to grow in an echo chamber. So we have to listen to other people. And the best way to do this is to assume they have something valuable to teach us that doesn't just merely affirm our own ego, and to do this assuming they have the best of intentions. It's very hard to listen to other people if you assume they're out to get you or your people. The third thing we can do is to find common values in any disagreement. This is deeper than any superficial surface level values. It goes deeper than the toxic tribalism we've divided ourselves by. Now, going back to braver angels, I have seen debates on every issue you would never want to bring up at Thanksgiving or on a first date. I'm talking things like abortion and gun control. People from different sides of the aisle, very opinionated people. And they've gotten along. They have debated these things civilly and left with more respect for each other than maybe when they came in. It is possible to listen to people who strongly disagree with us. That doesn't mean that we don't feel the heat rising in our chests and coming up to our face, right? But we hold it back a little bit. And we say, okay, I'm going to assume the best of you. Let's find some things we agree on. What I like to do is I like to start with the agreement before we get into the issue so that we can revisit them. We can, okay, I know we disagree on this, but remember we do agree on this. You find that first so that essentially the trunk of the tree, before you split out and get to the other branches that diverge from each other, the trunk of the tree is made of your common values, and that binds you together. Now maybe we don't like to listen to other people, their different opinions, because we're afraid that they might say something that will shift our perspective on the world so fundamentally that it'll throw us out of this sense of belonging. Now remember, belonging, like many other things in life, must be rooted in truth. Must be rooted in truth and love. So maybe we're afraid that, they'll say something and it'll shift our perspective on the world, and suddenly we had it all figured out, and now we don't. We knew who our tribe was, who we were, and now we don't. But this is also an opportunity to grow, to become more authentic in ourselves and in the world, to grow in truth. Y'all, we are some of the most complex creatures to have ever graced the earth, platypus notwithstanding. They're kind of weird. But we are incredibly complicated. And so it's no surprise to me that we have trouble belonging in ourselves and belonging with other people. We are almost constantly distracted by thoughts of the future, thoughts of the past, hypothetical scenarios that will never happen, hypothetical scenarios that could never happen. Like, we're constantly distracted. All these barriers we have, however, can be overcome. When it comes to belonging within ourselves, we can meet distraction with attention. We can meet the routine of going through our lives without reflecting on it with written reflection, to really analyze and study who we are and who we want to be. We can clearly and precisely articulate our values and then our goals to aim at the highest possible version of ourselves. When it comes to belonging with others, we can assume the best of them, especially their intentions, knowing that we can always revise it later. Assume the best of them as you would want to be done to you. We can find points of common agreement before, during, and after going into conversations that may make us upset. And of course, we can assume that everyone has something valuable to teach us that doesn't merely reaffirm our own ego. We can put people before politics and truth before fitting in. With these strategies, we can feel more at home in the world and ourselves. Thank you.